Prologue. At 6 in the morning, the heart of the city was still in a deep sleep. He paced the gray concrete in silence, each step deliberate. Before the world awoke, he took his steps as if to reassert his own order. That day, he huddled under an old blanket. The homeless man, crouched in the corner with his clothes on, looked up at him. He didn't say a word, but there was an unmistakable longing in his gaze. He dug into his pocket, pulled out a bill, and handed it to him. "You can have a hot meal with this," he said. It passed like part of a normal day. But a few days later, he would see that face again in court. The murder. He remembered the look in those eyes that morning. As he handed over the money in silence, he recalled vividly the moment, the cold touch of his robe. Something inside his convictions had quietly begun to fracture. What is justice? Is the law inherently just, or is justice merely defined by law? Chapter 1. The Silent Robe. He was a man of 35 to 40, as precise as an old clock, blending into the expressionless gray of the city. His habits were rigid, his routine mechanical, but there was a depth to him that was not easily read. A man who carried on without words. The silent tension of the weight-bearer was palpable. Every morning at 6, he ran through the sleeping city. Rain or shine or snow, he pounded the gray concrete in silence. At 6 feet 5, he was built from a steady diet of weights and running. He was not a soldier, but he was groomed like one. He was a judge by profession. He sat in the courtroom, striking his gavel in profound silence. Sexual assault, DUI, robbery, assault, murder, fraud. The daily assignments were like the gates of hell, opening and spilling out ashen shards. Some of the defendants wore deep regret on their faces, others a grave look. Some stared at the judge with grave eyes, others with mocking smiles. In wounded silence, the victims moved around the courtroom. Pain became evidence, tears became testimony. Even the brutal drama soon faded into the noise of everyday life. Life and crime passed like numb waves, unnoticed, unresolved. A mere background noise to society's relentless indifference. He did his job not because he believed in the law, but because people respected him, society looked up to him, and he earned a high salary and a robe that gave him quiet authority. But when he left the courtroom, he was just another man. In the morning, he watched the news and ate his breakfast, and after work, he went to his favorite gym and lifted heavy barbells. As his arms and shoulders burned, the dull metallic clang of steel echoed off the ceiling. The air was mixed with sweat and iron. Slowly, he peeled away the tension of the day. It was almost a release, another silence. Sometimes he laughed lightly and drank with old friends. Outwardly, everything was neat and tranquil. In robes, he looked like any everyday man. But he had one special ability, a talent they didn't teach him in law school. An intuition for seeing through human lies. A way to discern the truth faster than words. The slightest flutter in the pupils, hesitation between silences, and uneasiness in posture were signals he naturally picked up on. That made him a competent judge, but also a skeptic of society. Everyone wore a lie, and the truth was always dying a silent death. Tragedy always played in the same voice on the radio he left on. Murder, political embezzlement, child abuse, a fiery celebrity scandal flashed on TV. Another shooting scrolled across the subtitles. In the elevator, cafe, or across the table, people talked quietly or loudly. A whirlwind of information becoming increasingly suffocating. Faith had become the most expensive commodity, and piety a tool for power. Gunshots rang out in the name of God, and deals were made amidst prayers. Behind speeches wrapped in redemption, children died in burning villages. Some kidnapped claimed it was God's will. Each time, something cold stirred in his chest. Politics reigned as another faith everyone claimed to be for the people, but often served themselves. Truth was easily torn between factions, and people believed less as words flipped easily. Such lies flowed into his court. There was always someone on the wrong end, always someone who had fallen. It was he who faced victims and defendants daily. After finishing his verdict, he quietly walked away and closed the judgment. In silence, he lifted his coffee cup. The cooled coffee slid bitterly down his throat, leaving a strange shiver. He gazed out the window without a word. The indifferent cityscape drifted by. It was merely another day, another verdict. Yet a single thought lingered quietly in his mind as he stared through the glass. Light streamed through the buildings, people busy with their time. In the stillness, an indescribable emotion rose slowly inside him, a shadow of anxiety long alive within. Humans are not inherently good, he believed. Evil was not a choice but a premise, and the law was necessary to keep it in check. But rules differed for different roles, reversed by situations and standards always shaky. Moving silently with the weight of power, he lifted his coffee cup again and took the last sip. Anger grew quietly deep inside, nameless and dark. Outside, the scenery was unchanged. People moved at their usual pace. Yet now he saw cracks in the flow. Perhaps belief in human goodness was an illusion. Nature was more like evil, and law could only be temporary. Whose justice was justice, and why were standards so shaky? He put down his coffee cup, looking out the window again. Wordlessly, surely, something was awakening. The sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow over the city streets. He was heading home, a cigarette loosely hanging from his lips, when suddenly, sharp voices pierced through the evening air. A circle of bystanders stood silently, phones in hand, eyes flickering with detached curiosity. In the middle of the crowd, a young woman was repeatedly kicking an elderly homeless man sprawled helplessly on the ground. No one intervened, they simply watched, emotionless, spectators behind their screens. Instinctively, he pushed through the crowd, moving towards the center of the commotion. Without hesitation, he stopped right beside her, his voice low but firm. "Stop it!" She paused mid-kick, slowly, turning her head toward him, her gaze icy and defiant. Her lips curled into a subtle, mocking smile. Ignoring him completely, she reached into her bag, calmly pulling out a bottle of water. She drank casually, her movements deliberately slow, taunting him with her composure. Then, with calculated indifference, she poured the rest of the water onto the homeless man's battered face. A chill hung in the air. Without breaking eye contact, she tossed a thick bundle of cash onto the ground. Next to the man, bills, scattering carelessly across the pavement like discarded trash. For a moment, silence suffocated the street. Without another word, she turned her back, disappearing into the crowd. He stood frozen, the echoes of the scene etched into his memory. After a few silent moments, he turned away, pulling out his phone to quietly call the police, his mind swirling with a mixture of confusion and anger. He thought it ended there. But the very next day, as he sat smoking outside his office, the same woman appeared again. She approached without hesitation, reaching out to pluck the cigarette from his fingers, placing it between her lips as if it had always belonged there. Exhaling the smoke slowly, her eyes cold and unflinching, she whispered mockingly into his ear, "I was curious who made the call." She paused, a cruel smirk flickering briefly on her face. "You should know better. People like you don't last long when they meddle." Then, without waiting for a reply, she walked away, leaving him alone, the bitterness of her words lingering heavier than the smoke. From that moment, he knew she was not someone who would quietly fade from his life. Chapter 2. A familiar face. One evening, a few days later, he was on his way to the gym as usual. The shadows of the city under the reddish sunset lengthened slowly. The breeze carried the weariness of the day. At the end of the alley, a silhouette stood still in the street. It was the same man who had been beaten helplessly that day. He turned slowly, hands in his pockets and his gaze fixed into emptiness. He took a step forward, words escaping his lips, before he could stop himself. "The money you dropped that day, where did it go?" The man raised his head slowly and answered in a low voice. "Most of the people took it. I only managed to keep a few." After this short answer, he nodded once. There was no more eye contact, no more words. He turned slowly, hands in his pockets, and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, he paused at the crossroads. The statue of justice standing in its place, a cloth covering her eyes, a sword in her hand, and scales. Someone once said the blindfold represented impartiality, seeing beyond emotion. The sword symbolized the strict enforcement of law, and the scales embodied the delicate balance of justice. But in reality, the blindfold listens to the powerful. The sword is wielded by the strong, and the scales are forced to tip. We know this. Justice is a machine, but its weight is controlled by those in power. The morning sunlight pouring over the statue was cold, reflecting off its forehead, blindfold, and sword tip mechanically. And beneath it stood myself, numb like the statue, day after day, until I ceased to believe its truth. A sculpture that no one denies, but no one fully trusts. A belief drier than the morning air hung over the city. I closed my office door quietly and sat down. The indifferent morning sunlight shone through the window onto my desk. Flipping through a stack of judgments, one old case caught my eye, a DUI and hit and run. Familiar types, but the air and faces from that day came back to me faintly. The defendant's name was unfamiliar, but I recognized the face in the courtroom. I recognized his expression, the accusatory tone of voice, the forced smile, and the eyes constantly scanning the room. The statement was frequently interrupted, and hesitation was evident in every word. His unsteady posture was obviously trying to hide something. Next to him sat a defense lawyer from a large law firm. He spoke in a controlled, calm manner, reconstructing the case and arguing for a verdict, and spit out words like a script to sway the verdict in his favor. He smelled more of calculation than confidence. Sitting across from him, the man from the victim's family had trembling fingertips, suppressed sobs, and tears in the corners of his eyes every time he looked up to speak. Me. The eyes that looked at me spoke more than words. The verdict that day was handed down according to procedure, according to law. The logic on paper was impeccable. I remember the sentence was short, considering the circumstances. At the time, he believed the judgment was appropriate. But what sticks with me to this day is the sound of his voice in the courtroom hallway after the trial. It was his last cry. It was desperate, quiet, and lingering. The unrecorded moments are sometimes clearer, remembered more clearly. As I fell into a deep sleep after work, I remembered the scene from a few days earlier when my running toes suddenly stopped. The street, an old blanket curled up in the middle of the street, eyes looking up at me wordlessly, and a bill in my hand. "Please have a hot meal," he said. It was just another ordinary day until he encountered the man who had been trampled on the street the previous day. There was something hauntingly familiar about his face, a gaze he'd definitely encountered before. I couldn't remember exactly, but I can't shake the feeling of disorientation in the back of my mind. No, was it the same man who looked up at me from under the blanket that dawn? And if so, how much of this city? A few days later, I saw a familiar face on the local news. The calm anchor. Over the soothing anchor's voice, blurry CCTV footage played. The homeless man I'd handed a dollar bill to that morning was holding a knife, had been arrested for stabbing someone in front of a grocery store. The incident went like this. A man was shopping with his daughter, grocery store with his daughter, when he was stabbed for no apparent reason, and he died at the scene. The suspect did not provide a motive for the crime. His mental status was unclear. The camera clearly captured the man's movements, and his expression on the news screen was blank. Dozens of days later, I saw him again in court. His face was still emotionless. He sat in the accused's chair, looking exactly as I remembered him. Before the trial, I read the transcript of the case several times. The evidence was ample, the statements consistent. The victim's wife and daughter were in the courtroom today. They were present in court today. The wife stared straight ahead with a stern expression, and the girl had her head down and her hands clasped together. On the desk, there were photos of evidence, autopsy records, and psychiatric reports. But the most memorable part of the day was sitting on the bench. The moment I saw him again in the courtroom, the memory came back to me clearly. That haggard, wrinkled face, the stony expression, as if he was holding something in. Years earlier, I'd sat in the courtroom with the family of a drunk driving victim. I remembered the way he looked at me, choking back tears as I delivered the verdict. He was the victim's husband. Across from the defense attorney, acting like an actor on a stage, swallowing his pent-up anger and grief, he shook his head, who listened. I could still hear his cries ringing in my ears, and now here he was, sitting in the defense chair, accusing me of staring at me, silent, refusing to say anything. Something inside me broke into tiny pieces. What is a verdict? The man who once sat in a courtroom, swallowing his bitterness and anger and bowing his head to me, is now the one who must be judged before him, sitting as the accused. The fact that the victim-turned-perpetrator is sitting across from the perpetrator is a sign of the courtroom's symbolic distinctions of the courtroom. There is a space between the victim and the perpetrator that can be switched at any time. He was face to face. He became the recipient. The distinction between good and evil, between perpetrator and victim, so easily collapses. In that moment, the word justice seemed meaningless. The silent, unseen twists of fate, quietly rewriting the roles of victim and perpetrator. As he watched the unrecorded twists and turns of a life trickle into the courtroom, he felt an incomprehensible helplessness. This wasn't just a murder. It was a collapsed structure. The forgotten anger had returned. His fingertips paused on the pen. He took a long, deep breath and looked up. The landscape in front of me hadn't changed, but my standards of judgment were wavering. Chapter 3. Memories of a Fallen World. I started out as an ordinary president of a small company, in a quiet neighborhood. People said of me, "He's a true man, hard-working and sincere. He has a big heart, always caring and helping others," someone said. Someone said, "A person who is always caring and helpful," while another bitterly remarked, "Too good for his own good, naive to the ways of the world." But I didn't let those words get to me. The world is a place where people with different perspectives live anyway, and my job was to stay centered in it. I wanted to do good to someone if I could. I wanted to be a person of influence, where people who were intertwined with me could walk by me and feel a little warmer inside. Little by little, my company was established, and I found love, which came late in life at the age of 40. She didn't say much, but she was always there. I met a wife who stood by my side, and together we built a simple, solid family. Soon after, I had a lovely little girl in my arms. Every morning, I excitedly grabbed the lunchbox my wife had carefully packed for me. I would go to work, and in the evenings, I would walk to the sunset with my daughter in my arms. The warmth of her little hands. For me, every day was a miracle, a blessing that I wouldn't trade for anything. Then one day, my office door opened and a woman walked in. An unfamiliar yet strangely familiar presence. Urban. The way she dressed, the way she spoke, and how her eyes subtly glanced through her short hair, conveyed an unsettling familiarity, a quiet yet distinct sense of foreboding. Most of all, she walked in, with an attitude that seemed to shake the very air of the room. She introduced herself as an investor, handing me a business card emblazoned with the name of a prestigious law firm. Her proposal was logical, compelling, and supported by a plausible capital plan. At first, she was pleased. It was time for a change, and she clearly seemed capable. But within a few days, her words began to take on a different color. "Mr. President, the way the industry is structured these days. You know how it is, right?" Was quickly followed by a suggestion to change certain contract terms. Soon it was an invitation to meet with a specific person. And then he said softly, "If I take over this company." She hadn't yet made any investments or taken any equity, yet her actions implied an authority as though she already owned the place, subtly shifting the atmosphere into something unsettling. Sometimes she interrupted me, adjusted my logic, and acted like a co-owner in front of the employees. He was always polite and well-spoken, but underneath it all, he was a man who would not hesitate to get the results he wanted. "I knew you'd do it, sir," was her most frequent sentence. "I knew you'd do it, sir." The words were neither a compliment nor a suggestion. It was more like a command, a confirmation. There was always a sense of urgency in her speech. It was as if she were anticipating every move before they made it. I suddenly realized this woman didn't want to buy this company in the first place. She wanted to make me hand it over, to make me sell it. I knew you'd do it. Sounds like a compliment, but it's really a way of saying, I'll do it. I gradually became wary of every word that was spoken. She acted as if she already knew the ins and outs of the company before she bought it from me. It was as if she had been a part of the shadows of this company for a long time. I sat alone at my desk at night, rereading and rereading her emails. I wondered where I was going wrong, why this strange energy was creeping into my life, slowly undermining everything I had built, filling each quiet moment with an uneasy vulnerability that I couldn't escape. Still, I didn't back down. The hours I've walked, the structures I've built with my hands, and the family that believes in me and laughs at me. In the face of it all, I couldn't turn my back. Every evening when I came home, the smell of soup on the warm table soothed my fatigue. My wife would look into my eyes without saying a word, and my daughter climbed into my lap to tell me about her day. The small, precious things in life, the way the world was still alive. Then one day, as I was getting ready for work like any other morning, I got a call. It was the police. My wife and daughter had been involved in a drunk driving, hit-and-run accident while returning home. Right then and there, without a single goodbye, they were gone forever. Without saying goodbye, the two people who were everything to me left this world. By the time the police and paramedics arrived, it was too late. On the rain-slicked road, my wife clutched my daughter tightly in her arms, and the cold lay silently on the cold pavement. Amidst the shapeless fragments of a life without form or memory, I burst into tears. After that day, everything fell apart. My emotions, my mind, my life. I clung to my work and I survived one day at a time, trying to hold on to my sanity. But soon after, the police called. They said they had arrested a suspect, a young man drunk driving. He was a hit-and-run driver. I went to the police station and saw his face. It was a stranger. Until then, I had barely held on, but seeing him shattered everything. I quit my job, sold my company. I let it go. She showed up again, and this time she was blatant. Now you'll have to hand over the company. It's not worth it. I signed the contract without a word. Everything was meaningless. He wished to vanish, to erase himself entirely from this world. I wanted to disappear, somewhere beyond the reach of memory, somewhere I could forget myself. With the little money left, I wandered aimlessly across the world, staring blankly at people in unfamiliar streets by day. At night, I slowly disintegrated in the darkness. Alcohol consumed me day after day, eroding my will and leaving only emptiness. And I sought the arms of women who were not my wife in the clubs, bars and seedy motels of every city. Every time they laughed, I turned away, unable to bear the hollow sound, and fell asleep, exhausted in their indifferent embrace, drifting into oblivion as memories of warmth faded further away. Those arms there was no love, no name, only the smell of women's flesh, and the hope that, for a moment, I could erase the memory of my wife. I hoped. Gambling became my new drink, and numbers became another anesthetic. Day by day, the money disappeared quickly, taking me with it. The last vestiges of sanity faded away. In the midst of it all, I forgot how to laugh, and I couldn't cry. The world was colorful, and I floated in it, forgetting myself like the darkest shadow. Some days in a cheap hotel near the sea, some days next to a strange boy, singing in the street, some days not at all. I woke up on the back of a woman I don't remember. Endless nights followed, and in the darkness, I faded away, bit by bit. Years passed, and I returned to Korea. My money was almost gone, and I had no place to live, sleeping on the road, in the park. I washed my clothes and scavenged through trash cans for food. I didn't know who I was or who I was supposed to be. Then one day, I was smoking a cigarette on the corner of a wet alley when a man's face came into view. In my vision, it was him, the man who had taken my wife and daughter from me. My heart skipped a beat and I followed. His day became my day, and his movements became my movements, and his movements became my movements. Routine. He would smoke his cigarette with the same nonchalant expression. One day, I plucked up the courage to sit across from him. We shared a cigarette and a silence, and then, as if he had been preparing for a long time, he said, quietly, "It was her. She made me do it. I didn't do it on purpose. I didn't. I couldn't help it." The voice was low and broken, but it echoed through me, and the moment I heard it, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I remembered her eyes, her chilling laugh, the shadowy presence of her past. It wasn't anger, but a cold despair rose from deep within my chest. I went in search of her. I crossed the lobby of the building and stood in front of the tall, thick door. But she didn't even look at me. Or maybe she recognized me so well, she was trying to pretend not to. I searched her gaze eagerly. I realized then that I had been waiting for it. A longing I didn't want to admit was still inside me. A few seconds later, the door opened and I caught a glimpse of her. Her face was expressionless, her eyes cold, and she turned her head slightly to look at me. The smile, the look, that reassured me that she remembered me. When they dragged me away, I didn't even resist, as if the whole thing was a preordained rite of passage. Because in her world, maybe I was meant to be pushed that way all along. Clear. It was a day under a clear sky with a cool breeze, slowly sifting through the city center. The sun was neither hot nor indifferent. The sunlight was neither warm nor indifferent, and people were making their way to work. Meanwhile, I sat quietly on a roadside bench. There I was. I had nothing in my hands, and the people passing in front of me were not looking at me at all. It was as if, like I was never meant to be in the city. In the bright landscape of a bright day, I take my place like the darkest shadow. No one called me by name, and I had long since forgotten my own. That evening, as I crouched in a corner of the city, I suddenly realized that even the cold disregard I had received from her was now the only response that validated me. Was I crazy? Or had I finally come to grips with the fact that the streets were still crowded? As the sun slanted down and people brushed past me, no hunger, no fatigue, no sadness. Just as I was about to feel numb, she appeared. She walked majestically like a queen, strolling through the center of this city on her own feet. I recognized her instantly. The timeless eyes, the familiar curve of cynicism. And beneath those cheeks, she looked at me for a moment, and then smiled, a shadow of inexplicable contempt. And in that smile, there was mockery in it, but perhaps proof that she remembered me in her own way. In my hatred, I was still searching for such a link. It wasn't a longing, but a false comfort that I hadn't been forgotten. The words were not a greeting, a mockery, or a warning. They were simply the words of a man who believed himself to be in control of the world. A man who had stumbled upon a forgotten being, who believes he rules the world. I said nothing in response. She didn't seem to feel the need to continue either. And then she launched into an indiscriminate assault. Indiscriminate assault. I pulled a bottle out of my bag. I unscrewed the cap and drank the entire bottle. A relaxed, unhurried stroke. Just, you look like you've forgotten who you just trampled on. She slowly poured the remaining water over his face, and he remained motionless as the icy stream trickled down. At that moment, I felt someone push through the crowd and approach me. I didn't have to turn my head to know it were eyes that offered me something from the bottom of their hearts. The only warm gaze in this cold city. He walked slowly to the center of the commotion, looked down at her, and spoke in a low voice. "That's enough." The voice was small, but it had the power to awaken some sort of order that this city had forgotten. The woman slowly turned her head to look at him. A short silence. Then she flashed him a wry smile and shook her head. With a wry smile, wordlessly, effortlessly, she pushed her foot against my torso again. I didn't hurt anymore, and I didn't feel her gaze, except that the world was still hers, and it lay still in the shadows. A few days later, dawn in the city center, a man walked by and looked at me. As I crouched in the corner, the center of attention, he carefully pulled money out of his pocket and held it out to me. "I want a hot meal," he said, and his words were short. The voice was clear. His face was unfamiliar, but his eyes were strangely familiar, as if I had seen them somewhere long ago. Hovered, I lifted my head and stared at him for a moment, and then it hit me. The courtroom. The day I sat in the victim's box and held my breath. The injustice and anger as I stood before the deaths of my wife and daughter, and the man who delivered the verdict that day. It was the same judge, the one who gave far too little justice to the man who killed my wife and daughter. He was handing me the money now. His eyes were no longer good. Rather, it was a masquerade of goodness. It was indifference, the subtle compassion of one who had been silent, unable to change anything. I put the money in my pocket that night and made a final resolution: to kill the young man and never again to speak to anyone to cry. The next morning, I took the money the judge had given me and prepared a knife. In front of the grocery store he frequented, the man who became his father. I was walking out with my daughter. I lunged at the man, and then the memory cut off. I was handcuffed, and just before I was put in the back of a police car, I followed his disappearing gaze and saw nothing but his daughter crying. Was nowhere to be seen. I said in a whisper, "I'm sorry I hurt you." A few days later, courtroom. I was sitting in the accused's chair. In front of me sat the judge. He was reading the verdict towards me. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at that face, the same face that had sentenced my wife and daughter's killer years earlier. At the end of the hall that day, I swallowed back tears as I listened to him read the verdict. My anger and despair were his voice, and I silently hated him. And now he was before me again. The man who had handed me a bill for food on the street a few days earlier. A stranger. The look I thought was kindness. Now, all too familiar and cold, it was neither pity nor guilt. Memory. It was a look I hoped would never leave my mind, but it never did. I looked up at him, and he looked down at me. There were no words, but the silence spoke volumes. He looked at me. Maybe he remembered. Maybe, in his memory, I was no different from anyone else. But for me, the sentence he passed, the day was still as clear as yesterday. It all came flooding back. This courtroom, this world, these sins and punishments, the records of each day, all of it like an illusion. I felt it, and I thought, no one and nothing defines me, and I choose to be the final piece. Without saying a word, silently, with a knife in hand. Chapter 4, Architect of Order. People were talking about her a golden spoon. A woman backed by her father's power, whose emotions were unmoved by the very concept of success. But she knew her father's wealth was just the beginning. What she had built was a face that didn't show emotion. It was not a feeling, but a finely tuned strategy, a set of cold choices. No one's approval, no one's mercy. It was a cold structure, designed entirely by her own hands. And one day she would take her father's name. The moment would come when she would have to erase her father's name. For that moment, all the preparations were quietly accumulating. As a child, she was always well-groomed, always the first to sense subtle changes in the air. She consistently exceeded expectations, effortlessly reading every situation. Her report cards were impeccable, and the word exemplary always followed her name. Yet she soon realized that compliments were always for show, not for substance. It was a device to postpone expectations. Her father's face, glimpsed accidentally through the slightly open door, was disturbingly. Violent eyes blazing with rage, voice filled with venom. In that instant, a wave of confusion, fear, and helplessness washed over her, leaving a lasting mark on her young heart. He shouted at my mother, berated her, threw things at her, and sometimes even stabbed her in the back. At first I was confused, then I didn't understand. But the scene repeated itself, and the two of them seemed to me, it seemed to want to be seen. It was the face of authority that he had legitimized for himself. My father always seemed to want, and the desire was ingrained in his daily routine, like a habit. The way he looked at her was deliberately greedy. Even in front of his young daughter, he ran his hands casually over the maid's body and giggled. It was part of his power. The mother, on the other hand, different and yet alike. A strange man in a suit coming out of an alleyway was a familiar sight in a hotel lobby. She didn't ask direct questions. Instead, she recorded the time and place in her notebook. The weekend afternoon outings, a repeating pattern. It was evidence, a conclusion built on logic, not emotion. They ate at the table as if nothing had happened, and laughing as if nothing had happened, she suspected her family for the first time. And from that day forward, trust was gone. Trust was a fiction. Love was a condition, and sincerity was the antithesis of strategy. Instead of trusting people, she wanted to know, to manipulate, to control. We chose to leverage. I have one cold, clear principle: I don't trust anyone. I don't take chances with anyone. Her office was on the top floor of a glass-fronted skyscraper in the heart of the city. Morning sunlight peeked through the gray curtains. Through the gray curtains and beyond the window, thousands of reflections flickered dizzily in a chaotic blur. Down the street, people moved about, and she quietly interpreted the flow from above. The law once controlled everything. Believed. When she graduated from college at the top of her class and joined an advisory firm that blurred the lines between politics and finance, she didn't, but she did. She soon realized that while the law talks about ideals, the real world deals in interests. Didn't. She chose the truth that whoever controls the flow determines more than justice on paper. In times of crisis, she acquired struggling companies and pressured even healthy ones through questionable tactics. Proactively build relationships. She steered the media, and when necessary, she fronted whistleblowers in the name of the public good. When management faltered, she was there to accidentally emerge as an advisor, always quietly, without a trace. She left no names, only success. She was, though ostensibly described as a strategic advisor, she was actually at the top of the organization. The title on her business card was a device to make her look lightweight, and the power in the room was always at her fingertips. She controlled a multinational advisory network and asset management structure, orchestrating corporate mergers and acquisitions, and at times subtly influencing political outcomes behind the scenes. With each acquisition, she applies the same strategy to every acquisition. First, she approaches them, pretends to be an advisor, pretends to be an investor, says she can help, and then she gradually shifted her approach. It was important to get them to hand over the company voluntarily. You don't use threats. The only thing scarier than blackmail was the illusion of self-choice. And he was no different. A quiet, sincere man. A man who loves his family and lives by his principles. She knew from experience that those were the ones most easily broken. He'd been in the palm of her hand from the start. He averted his gaze whenever mentioning his wife and daughter, fingertips slightly trembling. She sensed that tremor, and soon judged. Emotion is not a variable. Emotions are manipulated. She made a plan to manipulate the emotion, and she made the necessary. She started calculating speed and temperature. Then one day, she recognized the incident in a single notification. Drunk driving, hit and run, 2 fatalities at the scene. A child and her mother. The driver was a young man. Everything was as it was supposed to be. She recognized the man's emotions and planned to take him down. And then she quietly engineered the surrounding conditions, a few sentences, an implied procedure, a set time and location, a schedule with implied procedures. The man believed it was a simple piece of paper. A seeming coincidence, it was actually a predictable puzzle. A body moved at a set time to a set location. After the event, she had it at her fingertips. Organized, emotionless travel. Names, drinking histories, routes, and blind spots were all within predictable categories, and each and every one of them was. The material was manipulable enough to be given meaning. The case would be written off as a simple accident, and public opinion would move in a clear direction. Without a clear direction, all the puzzles were assembled, as she had intended under calm numerical calculation. Him. She didn't have to face him, but sometimes, to make sure the last screw in the system was tightened, she had to go down there once in a while. I did, at night behind a dilapidated building. She dropped the black bag at his feet, her face expressionless. The moment was more. His eyes were long and cold. He nodded, his face frightened. She spoke briefly. Shut up and let me organize, Wei. Nod if you understand. She turned and walked away before he could answer. Her steps were firm, and the darkness around her did nothing to hinder her movement. She covered the case. The cop's mouth shut up. The press said nothing, and the trial ended with a one-line summary. The rain made it easier to see. Failed. The judge was unaware of all this. From above, there was a quieter, more tangible pressure. She found I hid the whole scene from him. I let only the necessary information flow and buried the rest in darkness. And time passed. Everything was tied up in knots, and her world returned to perfect silence. Then one day, the city is in the middle of nowhere. An old homeless man she thought she'd long since forgotten reappeared before her. His face was ragged, his eyes piercing. He felt more like a remnant of the past than a living being. He knew the truth, and it was a threat to her. It came at her with every ounce of strength she had left, even though she knew it couldn't be a threat to her. She watched it through the glass, through the office window. She looked down through the window. Reckless will, useless honesty. That evening, she sent a man to clear the vacant lot where he was staying, and headed there herself. Dressed in a black coat, she approached him in the middle of the street and stood expressionless. Wordlessly, slowly, she raised her hand and shoved his shoulder. He staggered, and without a moment's hesitation, she lifted her foot and pushed him to his feet. Kicked him. Gazes swarmed around them, smartphones in their hands, indifference in their eyes. Everyone was watching the violence, but no one crossed the line. After all, humans only speak the truth when they need to. Then between them, a tall man walked between them. He spoke in a calm voice. "That's enough." She looked at him for a moment. The eyes somehow unfamiliar, but it didn't matter. She retrieved a bottle of water from her bag. Her movements deliberate and controlled, eyes coolly fixed on the man as she drank deeply, savoring his visible discomfort. Calculated and deliberate, trickling coldly down his face. Not a single word was spoken until the very end, the silent action itself, communicating disdain more powerfully than words ever could. It was a chilling declaration. In this world, you remain insignificant. The message was unmistakably clear, transmitted through the icy temperature of the water. During the silent car ride home, she abruptly broke the quiet, inquiring about the man. Wordlessly, the attendant sitting next to her bowed his head. She said quietly, "Look him up. He must be the one who reported him." Within 2 days, he brought the report. Occupation, address, movements, everything. She quietly tracked down the judge's identity from then on. And a few days later, when she was having coffee with him as usual, she found him in the middle of an appearance before the judge. Wordlessly, she approached him, snatched the cigarette from his fingertips, and casually popped it into his mouth. His eyes wavered for a moment, but she blew out the smoke as if she were used to it. There was no cold laugh, but instead, she spoke in a low voice that seemed to swallow the mockery. "I was wondering who the asshole was that reported you. It was no threat, no warning. It was simply the cold declaration of one who had learned the rules of this world, looking down on those who were one step too late." What she thought would be the end of it, a few days later, caught her eye again. On the news, a murder. The suspect was none other than the very homeless man she'd been trampling. It was unexpected, but there was no surprise. Emotion was a luxury, and surprise was useless. She merely raised the corner of her mouth, like an audience member hearing an interesting line in an unexpected scene. It was a distraction from the boredom. On the day of the trial, she sat in the center of the courtroom, quietly but with dignity, a place where people in lawsuits came and went. But none of them knew the whole story. The one who held the most pieces of the puzzle was the one who sat silent. Chapter 5. Broken Promises. He learned the world with his fists. Home was hell, and when you got out of there was another battlefield school. There it was. Every day was a battle for survival, and for him, the fist came before the law. He had to avoid getting hit before striking. Someone dodged and ducked, but he was hit head-on. The echo of profanity and blood, the smell of cigarettes and dull thuds. It was routine, and so he naturally rose to the top of the lineup. In and out of school, his name was associated with terror. Money always followed his fists, whether he did things illegally or the right way. And there was no such thing as right for him. Whoever taught him what was right. The world wasn't fair, and he was the first to realize it. Then one day, at the local fast food joint, he pushed through the door, tired and wild-eyed as usual. For a moment, he saw her, a face with a different texture than the rest. Eyes that refused to give in to the world. For a brief moment, the world seemed perfectly quiet. He approached her instinctively. He did what he always did, spoke to her in a harsh, aggressive tone. But she stared at him, unmoved, and then cut him off with a snap. Enough. He paused. He was used to being ignored, to being called names, but she was different. She had a clarity that belied her age. The way she looked, the way she defended herself, the way she was clean-cut, the way she spoke so confidently. He'd never met someone so opposite of himself, who stood in direct opposition to him. She was unspoiled, unflappable, and most of all, she didn't give in easily. That strange distance made him feel like he was baffled and drawn. At the same time, at first it started as a playful curiosity, then slowly became an obsession, and finally transformed into something unfamiliar, genuine emotion. It was a longing, a yearning, a shock of seeing something that wasn't there. He visited the shop every day. In the sun, in the rain, in the pouring rain, he was there. Some days he watched silently from afar. Other days he confessed his feelings openly over 100 times. Each time she started with a sigh, but the look in his eyes changed with each passing day. At first it seemed like a joke, then a persistent tease, and finally a sincere one. They were 19 years old. It was clumsy and childish, but in the most sincere way you can be at that age. For the first time, he thought he wanted to change himself for someone. She was not easily swayed. If you really want to be with me, you have to promise me no smoking, no fighting, no late nights, no wandering around late at night. He smirked, but the words stuck in his mind. Throw the cigarettes in the trash. Instead, she learned to talk, and she spent her nights sitting idly under the streetlight in front of her house. One day, she said, "You try so hard to be funny, but do you think that's kind of cool?" They dreamed of a future together, and a year or so later, a lovely baby girl came along. Her parents furiously. Despite their objections, they chose each other. The man scraped together the money he'd saved in his darker days to buy a small room on the outskirts of They signed a lease and welcomed their child into a home. They started with old appliances and second-hand furniture. Money was always tight, life was harsh, leaving little room to breathe. But every day began with a child's cry. He was grateful and relieved to be able to put food on the table every night. He worked on construction boards during the day and at convenience stores at night. He worked at a construction board by day and a convenience store by night, while she took care of their child and wrote in between. She took on web fiction contests and freelance proofreading gigs. She sat in front of her laptop at night. The income was irregular, but at least I could work without getting my hands dirty, and I could keep my child by my side, by his side. It was hard work, but the laughter between them was constant, and for once it was genuine. One day, an old neighbor contacted him, offering to pay him quite a bit of money to run a simple errand for him. He said he had At first I said no, but the monthly formula bills, immunizations, pediatrician visits, and regular car breakdowns were piling up. The reality of an old boiler and water bills. All of these realities slowly eroded his judgment. Faster than a bank balance, the weight of a growing livelihood, he knew. He knew he was going back to the old ways. The rough, quick route, the effortless feel of making money returned, vividly, etched into his very bones. The cash in a few hours was worth many times more than his current toil. It was sweet, and there was more comfort in a clean bill than in sweaty overalls. The cost of formula for my baby, hospital bills, and mounting bills, the simple, risky act of making money felt honest. He knew this happiness was precious and warm, but it was so fragile. It could be shattered at a moment's notice. A glassy existence. The word morality had become a blur, and all I could think of were the habits of my youth. With 2 fists, the sensation that had pushed the world away returned to my fingertips. Late at night, in a drunken stupor, I confronted him again outside the local convenience store. He muttered in a low voice, "I'll do it again. I'll try again. One more time." The older brother nodded as if waiting. "Don't worry about it. All you have to do is get the documents from her and do what she says. It's simple. Don't talk too much. Don't ask stupid questions. Just do what you're told." A few days later, he headed to the appointed location, a quiet but oddly organized building just off the city center, and there, waiting for him, was a woman wrapped in cold air. It was as if she had calculated the exact time he would arrive. As if standing in the doorway, she held out her hand without turning toward him. "Just do what you have to do here. Don't think about anything else." She was well-groomed, sober, and looked like someone who had it all figured out. In that moment, he realized he was playing a game of simulation. He felt like he was inside a simulation. He asked, "My family, they won't be in danger from this, will they?" She replied without a smile, "I don't think so. Don't worry about it. Instead, don't give it a second thought, and just go along with the picture I've painted for you." And with that, he walked into someone's picture. But it wasn't a simple document delivery. It was a sophisticated, designed circumstances, concealed intentions. Eventually, he became a tool to end another's life. The news reported the death of a mother and daughter as a simple, drunken hit and run. He ended the truth in court. I couldn't tell her. I wanted to tell her everything, but I couldn't look her in the eye. Instead, all I got was a stamp on my account, a huge amount of money. The weight of poverty and reality forced them to swallow the truth, but the truth doesn't rot by asking. Time passed, but the air of that day, the woman's voice and the texture of the document remained at my fingertips. Fortunately or unfortunately, thanks to her working behind the scenes, he was quietly granted a special release. The incident was gradually forgotten. It was around this time, his wife embraced him with tears in her eyes. But as she looked at his face, she said with trembling lips, "This is our money? No, but we need this money so badly." She knew. Formula, hospital bills, maintenance bills. Life with a child easily crumbled in the face of reality. Ethics. She sat at her laptop at night working, and he grew more and more mute. One evening, he and his wife headed to the neighborhood grocery store to pick up some baby snacks and supplies. It was a more arduous walk home from work. The cart contained baby snacks, wipes, and a few small treats. After checking out in the alley, he exited. A homeless man was waiting for him. The memory was blurry. All he knew was that the blade sliced through his stomach, and I felt the warmth of blood coursing through my body. As he fell to the floor, he remembered his child's name. And then, for the last time, he missed his wife's hand. Dozens of days later, the court. A homeless man sat in the accused seat, and his wife and child sat next to him in the victim's seat. She squeezed his hand, unable to lift his head, and he rubbed his eyes sleepily in the unfamiliar space. The judge, the homeless man, her, and the victim's family. They were all in the same room. Chapter 6. The night justice was silent. A breathless stillness filled the courtroom. Through the tall glass windows, the pale morning light seeped in slowly, staining the judge's robe like a fading scar. He stared down at the verdict, line by line, the residue of the day on his dry fingertips, and then he lifted his head and looked at the accused, an old homeless man with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, of wrinkles over the backs of rough hands. But those eyes were still alive. It was the expressionless face of a man who had let go of everything, but deep inside the embers of a vengeance that had never been extinguished. What he saw was not just a judge, but the disillusionment of an age. The victim's wife sat on the witness stand. From start to finish, she repeated only one word. "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. I will." Her voice trembled, her despair quieter than her cries. Her hands clenched into fists, her fingertips taut as if they could break. She was trapped in her own pain, not in a courtroom. Neither side fought not the accused nor the bereaved family. Even the lawyers were going through the motions, but without enthusiasm. Everyone knew that this was just a way to tie up loose ends, that there was no emotion, no justice, no hope. Maybe everyone was avoiding the truth. We chose not to see the broken justice, not to ask about each other's sins. Eyes closed, the judge opened his mouth. I sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment. He wanted the death penalty. He'd seen too many times in his life that there were moments when the law could not save a man. Because it is, but the times do not allow for that, and perhaps, in this case, even the death penalty is hypocritical. There was. As the verdict was being finalized, the judge noticed a woman sitting in the back of the courtroom. It was her, sitting quietly, listening to all the smiles tugging at the corners of her mouth. Caught the judge's attention. She knew she had designed it all. The homeless man was staring at her, and at the end of that gaze, the judge realized that the three of them, in their interlocking tragedy, had the center. For a moment, those gazes dominated the courtroom. The silence of the three men made the air in the courtroom freeze solid. And then, no one spoke up and we moved on to the next procedure. A few days later, the homeless man was confronted by a young public defender in the detention center. If I have to go to the hospital or court, will I be transported in a vehicle? The lawyer looked puzzled. Yes, even while in custody, you will be transported if necessary. The homeless man nodded silently. The plan was clear now. Revenge was not far away. The escape was surprisingly easy. The day he was taken off-site for a doctor's appointment, he was just an old, helpless man. The back of his hand, the fine wrinkles on the back of his hand, and his frail gait elicited pity rather than suspicion. Even the prison guards were indifferent. He cracked jokes, and one even lent him a shoulder. But the gap was the gap. The moment he stepped out of the vehicle, he pulled out the blade he kept hidden on the inside of his wrist. It was a small blade he'd stolen from a hardware store. A long time ago, dull but still sharp. Not sharp, nor was it fast, but it was honest and deadly enough. The first guard faltered, clutching his side at the unexpected stab. The second, as soon as he realized what was happening, shouted over the radio and stumbled backward. But a single slash across his thigh brought him down. Detention center vehicle, blood, screams, and horror were all around him. He quickly ducked into the alley. People saw him, but no one approached him. They all looked away, or fiddling with their cell phones, but no one stepped forward. There was an unspoken agreement that they didn't want to be harmed. The city quietly passed him by, in which he resumed his role as a full shadow for the first time. The judge went to her. He wanted to know the truth of the case. He already felt all the pieces fitting together. He wanted the final reassurance, and he wanted to come face to face with the pinnacle of the truth. But before that, the homeless man had arrived near her office. He was in the dark shadows of the street across the building. In the shadows of the street, across the street from the building, keeping an eye on the doorway. At that moment, he saw the door open and the judge enter. Nothing. It felt like another betrayal of the homeless man. They're the same people after all. His thoughts were no longer simply organized by revenge. Now it was conviction. Something burst within him, and his hatred deepened in silence. Days later, he waited for the day he would face her alone. She met him in his office. She sat across from him, her face relaxed, as if it were a matter of course. Low over the curtain, the sunlight came in at an angle, half covering the table. The judge stared into the light for a moment, then lowered her eyes and opened her mouth in silence. Since that day, I have thought of this scene many times. She tilted her head slightly. What scene? The one where you're sitting here, like nothing happened after you planned all this. I never thought it would come true. I didn't know. She laughed softly. It wasn't planning, it was organizing. I just put things back in place that had fallen apart. And the judge, it's no different than what you do. But who is responsible for the lives that are destroyed as a result? Do you believe in justice outside the courtroom, or do you believe in the law? But who is responsible for the lives destroyed as a result? She pushed her chair back slightly, crossed her arms, and looked up at the ceiling. The law is always late. It's slow and imperfect, and so I thought we needed someone to set the pace, someone to move things along. The judge sighed. The result of your move is that you killed a man. You didn't make a ruling, you made a fate. You manipulated fate. She looked straight ahead again. So, Judge, you're saying that every ruling you've ever made has been right? That you've never gone with the flow? There were no words. Instead, the judge's eyes only grew deeper than before. And then the judge turned away, wordlessly, slowly. The shell of conviction and justice that had accumulated over countless days had crumbled away from her that day. He cracked silently in front of the horse. He realized that the standards of logic and law he had set up, maybe to cover someone's pain, might have existed to cover someone's pain. He was helpless. All the things I'd built up to someone else might have existed only to be cruel. The realization that everything I had built up could have been just cruelty to someone else pressed down on his back. The homeless man appeared before her. The place was still the same office, beyond the low-lit glass table. On one hand, the knife was there again, and her eyes burned. She quietly rose from her seat, not panicking. On the contrary, as if ready, she opened her bag and pulled out a prefabricated pistol, a crude, hastily made weapon. But her handiwork was precise. She squeezed the trigger straight away. Gunfire rang out. The first bullet grazed his shoulder. Blood spurted, but he didn't stop. She fired in rapid succession, pulled the trigger. The second grazed his abdomen. The third hit the wall. The fourth went into his leg, but it didn't stop him. She didn't back down, and her eyes were shot out. She did not dodge. The moment collided. He seized her arm, plunging his blade deep. Not even a short groan escaped her. She tilted her head and took a step back, leaning back against the glass table. The gun slipped from her fingertips, and it clattered to the floor. Opening her eyes, she looked up at him, barely able to catch her breath. Instead of pain, she saw an unknown release in his eyes. In his eyes, a look of pride, as if he'd finally gotten it all his way. Blood smeared the corners of her mouth, but she remained steadfast to the end. Her shoulders sagged slowly, and her head dropped, tilted to the side. Without moving, she closed her eyes silently. The judge approached quietly. He had already predicted the homeless man's behavior after the incident around her office. He'd often lurked around her office, following the man's shadow. Today, he finally saw it, lying on the floor, her and the homeless man still standing, out of breath. He wordlessly walked over and stood in front of the homeless man. The two stood in silence for a moment. Was this how you were going to end it all? The homeless man nodded expressionlessly. The judge couldn't even say anything. You gave the man who killed my daughter and wife a very light sentence. The judge took a quiet breath and closed his eyes. He was accepting the weight that lay before him. The law. This was the moment he decided that if someone had to judge what he had missed, he would be the one to receive it. Without a word, his head bowed slightly as if to surrender himself. Without protest, without even a last option, he quietly, homelessly bowed his head slightly, as if offering himself. He waited for the blade in his hand. The homeless man raised the knife without wavering. There were no words this time. Only the last sentence was running through his mind. Justice for whom? The night was long. The city had fallen into a deep sleep, and the early morning air was unusually cold. Away from the scene of the crime, the homeless man, with slow but steady steps, made his way to the center of the city. The surroundings were quiet, with only the faint sound of early street sweepers on the streets, of noise. He made his way to his prearranged spot, in front of the statue of Justice, his final stage. Even in the cold air, his eyes were clear. The judge's body was placed in a chair, his eyes sewn shut with thread. In his hand, he held a bloody knife and a crushed wad of money. He placed before him the image of the woman he had killed. The bodies were laid together, as if in an unspoken declaration to remake the order of the world. In the still dark dawn of the morning, in the center of the city, in front of the statue of justice, a staged body lay in the center of the city. A judge is in a chair. His eyes were sewn shut with thread, and a thin smile remained at the corners of his mouth. A bloody knife in one hand, in his other hand, a bundle of money scattered in the air. Before him, a young woman was lying on the floor, blood dried on her face, her hands splayed out helplessly. And beside them, another body, a homeless man. The blood from one leg was already dripping down the asphalt. Along the asphalt, and his fingertips were outstretched, almost touching the statue of justice. Gunshot wounds to his shoulder and abdomen had left him, and that's where he ended it all. The city came back to life. The news called it the work of an escaped inmate, and the legal community called it a failure of vigilance. The legal community discussed a failure of vigilance, and public opinion was swept under the rug. But those who remembered that dawn knew. That dawn there had been a scene, a moment that the law had not seen. It was not just violence. It wasn't just revenge. It was an explosion of long-pressed questions. What is justice? Who deserves to speak? Justice. All those questions were revealed in blood and silence before words. There was no condemnation, no redemption, only 3 bodies lying silently, each facing their own direction. That day at dawn, the city faced its own mirror and began to turn again, as if nothing had happened.